How did your family show their priorities? I was 14 when I learned that a gas tank matters more than a dying child. The aura hit first, that shimmer at the edge of my vision that meant 30 seconds before everything went wrong. I'd been having seizures since 12, grand mal episodes that turned me into a convulsing stranger, while my brain misfired like broken electrical wiring. "Dad," I managed to say, my voice already sounding distant. "Something's wrong. I think I'm going to have a seizure." The shimmering was spreading now, turning the desert landscape into fractured light. Dad glanced at me in the rearview mirror with mild annoyance. "Can you hold it until we get home? We're making good time." Mom didn't look up from her phone where she was posting wedding photos. That's when Dad noticed the gas gauge hovering just above empty, and everything changed. "Shit," he muttered, then glanced at Mom apologetically for swearing. "We need gas. There's a station coming up." The seizure was building like a wave gathering strength before it crashes. I could feel my muscles beginning to tense, my breathing becoming shallow. "Dad, please," I begged, but my words were slurring. "Hospital first, then gas." He was already signaling for the exit, not because of my medical emergency, but because the needle was approaching red. Mom finally looked back at me, saw my face contorting, and for a moment, I thought she might tell Dad to skip the gas station. Instead, she said, "It'll just take 2 minutes, honey. Try to hang on." The Chevron station appeared like a mirage, its red and blue sign promising relief for our tank, but nothing for my deteriorating brain. Dad pulled up to pump 3 and turned off the engine. The air conditioning died, and Arizona heat immediately began seeping into the car like an oven. My 8-year-old sister Chloe woke up, blinking in confusion. "Why did we stop?" she asked. Mom was still absorbed in her phone. "Daddy needs gas. We'll be moving in just a minute." I wanted to scream that we wouldn't be moving anywhere if I had a seizure in the back seat, but my tongue felt thick and unresponsive. Dad was taking his time at the pump, checking sports scores on his phone while gas flowed. The seizure was so close now that electricity was building in my brainstem, that terrible anticipation of losing myself completely. My hands started shaking, sweat pouring down my face despite the growing heat. "Mom," I whispered, but she was typing responses to wedding photo comments. The convulsions started exactly as Dad finished pumping and went inside to pay. First came violent jerking of my arms, then legs, then my entire body thrashing against leather seats like a fish dying on deck. Chloe screamed and pressed herself against the far door, terrified by her brother's transformation into something unrecognizable. Mom finally put down her phone and turned around completely, watching in horror as I convulsed uncontrollably. Foam mixed with blood appeared at the corners of my mouth where I'd bitten my tongue. My eyes had rolled back, showing only whites, and the sounds from my throat were inhuman grunts and gurgles. "Oh my God," Mom whispered, finally understanding this wasn't something I could just hold. "Oh my God, what do I do?" She should have called 911 immediately, should have timed the seizure, should have moved Chloe to safety. Instead, she sat frozen while Dad stood in line inside, probably buying snacks. The seizure lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds, though Mom wouldn't know that because she never thought to check time. When it finally ended, I lay unconscious in a pool of my own saliva, body limp and unresponsive. Chloe was crying hysterically, asking if I was dead. Mom reached back to check my pulse with shaking fingers, finding it rapid but strong. That's when Dad finally emerged carrying chips and a big gulp. He took one look at the scene and dropped his snacks on asphalt. "What happened?" he demanded, as if the answer wasn't obvious from my unconscious state and Chloe's tears. Mom was crying now too, shock finally hitting. "He had a seizure, just like he said he would. We should have gone to the hospital first." Dad's face went through confusion, guilt, then defensive anger. How was I supposed to know it would happen right now? He's had them before and been fine. The ER staff at Desert Valley Medical took one look at me and immediately called for neurology. I was still unconscious 20 minutes after the seizure ended, which meant this wasn't typical. They wheeled me into Trauma Bay 1 and started an IV, drawing blood for emergency labs while hooking me to monitors that beeped ominously. My parents sat in plastic chairs answering intake questions from a nurse who looked increasingly concerned as the story unfolded. "You stopped for gas during a medical emergency?" she asked, her professional demeanor cracking. Dad shifted uncomfortably and mumbled about the tank being empty. Mom stared at her hands, probably realizing how their decision sounded to someone whose job was saving lives. Chloe curled up in the corner chair, still wearing her flower girl dress, traumatized by watching her brother convulse, while her parents prioritized automotive convenience over his life. Dr. Amanda Foster appeared 2 hours later with test results and a grim expression. She was young, probably early 30s, with the intensity that comes from choosing emergency medicine. "Jordan's blood work shows severe dehydration and elevated stress hormones," she announced, reviewing the chart. "The seizure lasted over 4 minutes, which puts him in status epilepticus territory. That's life-threatening." She looked directly at my parents. "Seizures of that duration can cause permanent brain damage or death. How long did it take you to get him here after it started?" Mom's voice was barely a whisper when she admitted they'd stopped for gas first. Dr. Foster's pen stopped moving, and she looked up with barely concealed disbelief. "You stopped for gas during an active seizure emergency." Dad tried explaining about the empty tank, about not wanting to run out of fuel, but each word made it sound worse. Mr. and Mrs. Dalton, Dr. Foster said, using their last name like a weapon. Delaying treatment for status epilepticus is equivalent to stopping for gas while someone's having a heart attack. You're incredibly fortunate Jordan didn't suffer permanent neurological damage. Her words hung like an indictment. I woke up 6 hours later to steady beeps and antiseptic smells. My head felt like concrete, tongue swollen where I'd bitten it. Mom was asleep beside my bed, makeup smeared from crying. Dad paced by the window, probably calculating hospital costs. When Dr. Foster came to check on me, she asked if I remembered what happened before the seizure. I told her about warning my parents, begging them to go to the hospital first, watching Dad pump gas while my brain misfired. Her jaw tightened as she made notes that would probably become part of a permanent record. Jordan, Dr. Foster said quietly, I need to ask you some questions privately. Would your parents mind stepping out? Something in her tone made Mom wake immediately, and both parents looked nervous about being excluded from medical conversation about their own child. But they left reluctantly, sensing they were already in trouble with hospital staff. Once alone, Dr. Foster pulled her chair close to my bed and spoke in the gentle voice medical professionals use for difficult topics. Has this happened before? Your parents ignoring medical needs or delaying treatment? The question caught me off guard because I'd never thought of their behavior as neglect. They were just busy people who didn't understand seizures, who treated my epilepsy like inconvenience rather than serious medical condition. But as I thought about her question, memories surfaced that I'd pushed down or explained away, like the time I had a seizure at Chloe's soccer game and Dad made me wait until halftime ended because he didn't want to miss her penalty kick. Or when Mom delayed my medication because she was on an important work call that couldn't be interrupted. Or countless times they'd minimized my condition, telling relatives I was just dramatic or seeking attention, when seizures disrupted family plans. Each incident alone seemed like poor judgment, but together they painted a pattern of medical neglect that made Dr. Foster's questions feel urgent. Sometimes, I admitted, voice barely audible. They don't really understand how serious seizures can be. Dr. Foster nodded like she'd heard this story before, then made more notes that would become part of official documentation. The social worker arrived the next morning while I ate hospital breakfast that tasted like cardboard. Her name was Patricia Vance, and she had calm, professional demeanor that put me at ease while making my parents nervous. She asked to speak with me alone again, and this time Dad objected forcefully. He's our son. We have a right to be present for any questioning. Ms. Vance explained patiently that she was required to interview minors privately in cases where medical neglect was suspected, and that my parents could consult with their lawyer if they had concerns. The word lawyer made Mom go pale, and suddenly the room felt charged with different electricity than my seizures produced. This wasn't just about medical treatment anymore. This was about whether my parents were fit to make life and death decisions about my care. Ms. Vance asked me to walk her through not just yesterday's incident, but the entire history of how my family handled my epilepsy. I found myself describing years of minimization, delays in treatment, missed medication doses, and dangerous situations where my seizures were treated as inconveniences rather than medical emergencies. She took detailed notes and asked follow-up questions that helped me see patterns I'd never recognized. Jordan, she said finally, what would you want to happen if you had another seizure? What would ideal medical care look like? The question was simple but profound because no one had ever asked what I needed to feel safe. I described immediate medical attention, proper timing of seizures, consistent medication schedules, and family members who understood that my brain condition wasn't optional or negotiable. Ms. Vance nodded and wrote everything down, building what felt like a case for treating me like a human being rather than a burden. Her investigation would take weeks, during which time everything in my family would change forever. Dr. Foster returned that afternoon with neurology specialist Dr. Raymond Kim, who reviewed my brain scans with scientific precision. They spread images across a light board, pointing out areas where my brain showed scarring from previous seizures that had lasted too long or been inadequately treated. This damage is cumulative, Dr. Kim explained to my parents, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as medical evidence mounted. Each prolonged seizure causes more harm, and eventually that harm becomes permanent. Jordan is fortunate yesterday's episode didn't cause visible new damage, but he can't keep experiencing status epilepticus without consequences. He recommended immediate changes to my medication regimen, strict adherence to dosing schedules, and emergency protocols that my family would need to memorize without deviation. The complexity of proper seizure care seemed to overwhelm my parents, who had apparently been winging it for 2 years. The hospital kept me for 3 days of observation and medication adjustments, during which time my parents received what amounted to medical education boot camp. Nurses taught them how to time seizures, when to call 911, how to position me safely, and what constituted true emergency versus manageable episode. They learned that stopping for gas during medical crisis was not just poor judgment, but potentially criminal negligence. Mom broke down crying during one session, finally understanding how many times she'd failed to protect me adequately. Dad remained mostly defensive, asking questions about liability and whether the hospital was required to report their behavior to authorities. The nurse's patience was clearly wearing thin with parents who seemed more concerned about legal consequences than their child's well-being. I watched from my hospital bed, feeling like an observer of my own life, rather than the person whose brain was center of all this drama. But the real shock came on my second night when I overheard my parents talking in the hallway, thinking I was asleep. "This is going to cost us everything," Dad was saying, his voice tight with stress. "The medical bills, the legal fees if they take this further, missing work for all these appointments." Mom's response made my blood go cold. "Maybe we should have just let nature take its course. These seizures are getting worse, and the medications aren't working anyway. How long are we supposed to keep fighting this?" Dad was quiet for a long moment before responding. "The doctors say he could live a normal life with proper management, but you're right about the cost. This is going to bankrupt us." I lay in that hospital bed listening to my parents discuss whether keeping me alive was worth the financial burden, and something fundamental shifted in how I saw my family. The next morning, I asked Dr. Foster directly what would happen if my parents couldn't afford to take care of my medical needs properly. She looked at me with compassion that made me want to cry. "Jordan, no parent should ever have to choose between their child's health and financial stability. There are programs, assistance options, ways to make sure you get proper care regardless of cost." But I could see in her eyes that she understood what I'd overheard, that my parents were already calculating whether I was worth the investment. When Ms. Vance returned that afternoon, I told her about the conversation I'd heard. Her expression darkened as she made more notes in her ever-growing file about my family's handling of my medical condition. The investigation was no longer just about the gas station incident. It was about whether my parents saw me as a son worth saving or a financial burden they were tired of carrying. Ms. Vance's final report was devastating when she presented it to my family 3 weeks later. We gathered in a conference room that smelled like industrial disinfectant and featured inspirational posters about healing and hope. She opened her thick folder and began reading from an official document that chronicled every instance of delayed or inadequate medical care I'd described. The gas station incident was just the most recent example of a pattern stretching back to my original diagnosis. But there were new revelations too, information she'd gathered from school records, medical files, and interviews with teachers who'd witnessed my parents' neglectful behavior. "On November 15th of last year," she read, "Jordan had a seizure during parent-teacher conferences. Instead of calling for medical assistance, his parents waited until the seizure ended and then continued with their scheduled meetings, leaving Jordan alone in the hallway to recover. In March, Jordan's teacher reported that he frequently came to school without having taken his morning medication because his parents were too busy with work to ensure proper dosing schedules. Each revelation hit like a physical blow, painting a picture of systematic neglect that went far beyond simple misunderstanding of medical needs. My parents sat in stunned silence as Ms. Vance detailed incident after incident where they'd prioritized convenience, cost, or their own schedules over my health and safety. The most damning evidence came from Chloe's interview, conducted at school with a child psychologist present. My 8-year-old sister had described multiple occasions where my parents had told her to ignore Jordan when he's being dramatic, and had made jokes about my seizures being fake or exaggerated for attention. She'd even drawn pictures during the interview showing our family, with me lying on the ground while everyone else stood around looking annoyed rather than concerned. "Based on my investigation," Ms. Vance said formally, "I'm recommending that Jordan's medical care be supervised by the state until his parents demonstrate competency in managing his epilepsy, and I'm also recommending a full investigation into potential medical abuse and neglect charges." The words medical abuse and state supervision hit my parents like physical blows. Dad's face went white, then red, then white again as he processed the implications. Mom started hyperventilating, probably realizing that their casual dismissal of my medical needs could result in criminal charges. "What does that mean exactly?" Mom asked between shallow breaths. Ms. Vance explained that a court-appointed medical guardian would oversee my care, that my parents would lose the right to make unilateral medical decisions, and that they would be subject to random home visits, mandatory parenting classes, and comprehensive evaluation of their fitness as caregivers. The courtroom drama that followed felt like something from a legal thriller, except it was my life being dissected by lawyers and judges. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a woman named Lisa Chen, who specialized in child endangerment cases. She laid out the evidence against my parents with methodical precision: the gas station incident, the pattern of delayed medical care, the financial conversations about whether keeping me alive was worth the cost, the documented instances of leaving me alone during seizures while they attended to other priorities. She brought in medical experts who testified about the cumulative brain damage caused by untreated status epilepticus seizures, education professionals who described my parents' dismissive attitude toward my medical needs, and child psychologists who analyzed Chloe's drawings and interviews. The case against my parents was overwhelming, built not on a single incident, but on years of systematic medical neglect. My parents' defense attorney, a harried-looking man named Robert Singh, tried to argue that they were loving parents who simply didn't understand the seriousness of epilepsy and had made mistakes out of ignorance rather than malice. He portrayed them as overwhelmed, financially stressed, and doing their best under difficult circumstances. But his arguments fell apart when the prosecution played recorded conversations from the hospital where my parents discussed the cost-benefit analysis of keeping me alive, and when they presented evidence that my parents had been repeatedly educated about seizure management but had chosen to ignore medical advice when it was inconvenient. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Foster, who explained in clinical terms how many times my parents' decisions had put me at risk of death or permanent brain damage. In my 15 years of emergency medicine, she said, I have never seen parents so consistently prioritize convenience over their child's life-threatening medical condition. Judge Angela Roberts took 2 hours to review all evidence before delivering her verdict. The courtroom was packed with social workers, medical professionals, and family members who had come to witness what had become a landmark case about medical neglect. This court finds that the defendants, while not intentionally malicious, have demonstrated a pattern of medical neglect that has repeatedly endangered their child's life, Judge Roberts announced. The evidence shows that these parents have prioritized financial concerns, personal convenience, and social obligations over their son's life-threatening medical condition to such a degree that continued unsupervised care would constitute ongoing child endangerment. She granted the state's request for supervised medical care, ordered my parents to complete extensive parenting education, and mandated psychological evaluation to determine whether they were capable of putting their child's needs before their own comfort and convenience. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, this court is deeply troubled by evidence suggesting that the defendants have discussed whether their son's life was worth the financial burden of his medical care. No child should ever have to wonder if their parents consider them worth saving. She ordered family counseling, financial counseling to help my parents understand available assistance programs, and most importantly, appointed Dr. Ellen Martinez as my medical guardian. Dr. Martinez was a retired pediatric neurologist who specialized in helping families manage childhood epilepsy, and she would have final authority over all medical decisions until my parents proved they could be trusted with my life. The courtroom erupted in whispers as people processed the severity of the ruling, and my parents sat in shocked silence as they realized how completely their world had changed. The transformation of my home life under state supervision was immediate and dramatic. Dr. Martinez installed seizure monitoring apps on everyone's phones, created laminated instruction cards for every room, and established medication schedules that were treated like military operations. She conducted surprise visits at random times, checking that protocols were being followed and that my parents weren't reverting to their old patterns of neglect. Most importantly, she made it clear that any deviation from established medical procedures would result in my immediate removal from the home. The house felt different, with official oversight hanging over everything like a sword waiting to fall, and my parents struggled to adjust to a reality where their child's medical needs took absolute priority over everything else in their lives. Mom threw herself into epilepsy education with desperate intensity, joining online support groups and reading medical journals like her life depended on it. She learned to recognize my seizure triggers, memorized medication schedules down to the minute, and practiced emergency techniques until she could perform them automatically. But she also struggled with the emotional weight of realizing how badly she'd failed me, breaking down crying whenever she encountered information about the brain damage that untreated seizures could cause. Dad was less enthusiastic about the education requirements, treating them like mandatory corporate training rather than life-saving skills. He complained constantly about the time commitment, the invasion of privacy, and the financial cost of proper medical care, but he participated because the alternative was losing me entirely, and even he understood that some battles weren't worth fighting. The tension in our house was palpable as my parents struggled to adapt to supervised parenting. Chloe became an unexpected ally during this period, having been traumatized by watching my seizure at the gas station and the subsequent family upheaval. She started asking questions about my epilepsy, wanting to understand why I needed so much medical care and why our parents had been handling it wrong. Dr. Martinez spent time educating her too, teaching her age-appropriate ways to help during my seizures and making her feel like an important part of my care team rather than a bystander to family drama. Chloe's drawings changed too, evolving from images of our family ignoring my medical emergencies to pictures of everyone working together to keep me safe. Her innocent questions often cut straight to the heart of issues that adults were dancing around. Why didn't Mommy and Daddy know how to help Jordan before the judge had to teach them? The mouth of babes, forcing my parents to confront their own negligence through their 8-year-old daughter's clarity. The most difficult part of the supervised period was learning to trust my parents again after discovering how they really felt about the burden of my medical care. The conversation I'd overheard in the hospital hallway haunted me, making me question whether their newfound attention to my health was genuine concern or just performance for Dr. Martinez and the social workers. Every medication they gave me, every seizure protocol they followed, every emergency response they practiced felt like it might be just for show. I started having anxiety attacks in addition to seizures, terrified that if I became too expensive or inconvenient, my parents would find ways to get rid of me despite the court supervision. Dr. Martinez recognized these trust issues and recommended individual therapy for me, helping me process the trauma of realizing that my own parents had considered my life optional based on cost-benefit analysis. The therapy sessions with Dr. Rebecca Walsh were both helpful and devastating as I worked through years of internalized neglect and self-blame. I'd spent so long making excuses for my parents' behavior that I'd convinced myself their neglect was somehow my fault for being sick. Dr. Walsh helped me understand that children shouldn't have to earn their parents' care through good behavior or convenient timing, and that medical conditions aren't character flaws or punishments. She also helped me process the guilt I felt about the state intervention that had torn my family apart, reminding me that I hadn't asked to be neglected, and that protecting myself wasn't betraying my parents. The work was slow and painful, involving months of unpacking emotions I'd buried under years of trying to be the easy, sick kid who didn't cause too much trouble for his overwhelmed parents. 6 months into the supervision period, Dr. Martinez conducted her evaluation to determine whether my parents had genuinely changed or were simply performing compliance. She reviewed medication logs, tested their knowledge of seizure protocols, and interviewed me extensively about whether I felt safe with their level of care. The improvement was undeniable. My seizure frequency had dropped significantly with proper medication management, and my parents now responded to medical concerns immediately rather than trying to minimize or delay them. More importantly, they had completed family counseling and seemed to genuinely understand that my life had value regardless of its cost or inconvenience to their schedules. When I told Dr. Martinez that I finally felt like my parents saw me as worth saving, she smiled for the first time since I'd met her. Her recommendation to the court was cautiously optimistic. Supervision could be lifted, but with mandatory follow-up evaluations every 6 months for 2 years. The final court hearing was surprisingly emotional as Judge Roberts reviewed Dr. Martinez's positive report and the evidence of my parents' transformation. They had completed all required education, passed comprehensive competency evaluations, and maintained 6 months of excellent seizure management under supervision. More importantly, they had undergone psychological counseling that helped them understand how their financial stress and overwhelmed emotional state had led them to dehumanize their own child's medical needs. Dad stood up during the hearing and made a statement that surprised everyone. "Your Honor, I want to thank the court for forcing me to confront what kind of father I had become. I almost killed my son because I was more worried about gas money than his life, and I will spend the rest of my life making up for that." Mom was crying as she added that she never wanted me to feel unsafe about my medical needs again, and that she understood now that love without competence could be just as dangerous as outright abuse. As we left the courthouse, the weight of the past year settled over our family like a heavy blanket. We had survived state intervention, mandatory education, supervised parenting, and the public humiliation of having our private failures dissected in legal proceedings. But we had also emerged as a fundamentally different family, one where my medical needs were treated as non-negotiable priorities rather than inconvenient burdens. The drive home was quiet, each of us processing how much had changed since that day at the gas station when my parents chose automotive convenience over their son's life. Dad broke the silence by saying something that felt like both an apology and a promise. "Jordan, I want you to know that if you ever have another seizure, nothing else in the world will matter until you're safe." Mom reached back to squeeze my hand, adding that they had learned the difference between loving a child and actually protecting them. 2 years later, our family has achieved something that once seemed impossible. I trust my parents completely with my medical care. They carry seizure medication everywhere we go, know the location of every hospital within 50 miles of home, and have never again prioritized convenience over my safety. When I had a breakthrough seizure at Chloe's birthday party last year, Dad timed it precisely while Mom cleared the area and called our neurologist before it even ended. The gas station incident feels like a story about different people now, though the hospital records and court documents remind me it really happened. Sometimes I wonder what would have become of me if Dr. Foster hadn't asked the right questions, if Ms. Vance hadn't investigated thoroughly, or if Judge Roberts hadn't taken medical neglect seriously enough to intervene. I probably would have continued having poorly managed seizures until one eventually caused permanent brain damage or death, and my parents would have convinced themselves it wasn't their fault. The most important lesson from this experience is that good intentions aren't enough when it comes to protecting vulnerable children, and that sometimes families need outside intervention to learn how to love each other properly. My parents genuinely believed they were doing their best with my epilepsy, but their best wasn't medically adequate and could have killed me. It took a crisis, legal intervention, and mandatory education to transform them from loving but dangerous caregivers into people I could trust with my life. Not every family gets that second chance, and not every child survives the learning curve of incompetent parents, but I'm grateful that mine did. Today, when we pass that Chevron station on the highway, nobody mentions what happened there, but we all remember, and we all know it will never happen again, because sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes you need competence, accountability, and the courage to admit when you're failing the people who depend on you most.